In our section on note values, we discussed whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, sometimes with dots, all different note values. Now let's place these notes so they can represent a pitch. A pitch is a sound determined by the speed of a vibration from the source of the sound. A source means, in our case, musical instrument. And these vibrations create a pitch. The thinner the vibration, the faster the vibration, the higher the pitch. The slower the vibration, the lower the pitch. We begin with a staff or a stave, which has 5 parallel lines. Any one of our notes can be placed on one of these 5 lines or 4 spaces. Let's work with a whole note. Now, the next element to identifying a pitch is added. That's called a clef. There are many clefs, but let's start working with the treble clef. Each note placed on the treble clef has a name corresponding to the first 7 letters of the alphabet, starting with A and ending with G. These 7 note names are repeated indefinitely. On the staff with a treble clef, A is on the second space. Continuing up, the next note is B. That'll be on the 3rd line. Then the 3rd space is C, the 4th line is D, the 4th space E, the 5th line F, and above the staff, a G. Now we can see the succession of notes from A to G on the treble clef staff. If we place a note below or lower than the second space A on the 2nd line, it is a G. Remember, the alphabet goes from A to G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and if we go down, we reverse the alphabet. So that line, the 2nd line, becomes a G, the 1st space an F, the lowest line an E, and below the staff a D. As the notes ascend, the pitch becomes higher. When the notes descend, the pitch becomes lower. This is true of all traditional music notation. The treble clef is sometimes called a G clef because it circles the G on the 2nd line. This clef is used for treble instruments and voices, or the highest pitched instruments and voices, the soprano voice, and instruments like flute, oboe, clarinet, trumpet, horn, violin, and the upper part of the piano, often played with the right hand. If we would like a note below the D, which is on the bottom of the staff, we need to add what is called a ledger line. If we add this ledger line, we then can put a note on that line and it will be a C, 1 note below the D. This ledger line can be used in either direction. So the note above the treble clef staff is a G. If we add a ledger line and put a note on that ledger line, it will be an A. These ledger lines can be used above or below the staff, and there is no limit to how many ledger lines we can add. But after 4 or 5 ledger lines, the notes become very difficult to read. Let's go back to the single ledger line below the treble clef staff. This note is a C. If we add a note below this ledger line, we create a B. And if we add a 2nd ledger line and place a note on that 2nd ledger line, it will be an A. We always remember that it is the 7 letters of the alphabet that we use in naming notes. So if we're at a C and go down, descending in pitch, then it goes to a B. And if we add a 2nd ledger line and place a note on that line, it will be an A. Now let's look at all the different notes that we've discussed, from the A below the treble clef staff to the A above the staff. Now we see there are 3 A's, 1 below the staff, 1 in the middle of the staff, and 1 above the staff. These three notes all sound like the same pitch, but one is low, one is in the middle register, and one is high. If we count from the low A to the middle A, we see that the middle A is the eighth note above the low A. The distance from one A to the next is called an octave, which comes from the Latin octava, meaning 8-part. We can now read 2 octaves of music on the treble clef. The low A to the middle A is 1 octave. The middle A to the A above the staff is the 2nd octave. There are 2 memorization tools that some use to remember the treble clef notes. The spaces are F, A, C, E, which of course spells face, and the lines are E, G, B, D, F. Every good boy does fine. The other most commonly used clef is the bass clef, used for the bass instruments like the trombone, tuba, bassoon, cello, string bass, and the bass notes on the piano. First, we begin with the 5 horizontal lines of the staff, and then add the bass clef to the beginning of that staff. The lowest space is an A. As we ascend from that space to the 2nd line, and then to the 2nd space and upwards, we once again spell out the 7 letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, with the top line repeating the pattern with an A. Once again, the low A to the upper A is 8 steps, or an octave. Now notice the 2 small dots on the right side of the clef. These dots are on either side of the 4th line where the F sits. Therefore, the bass clef is also called an F clef. Continuing to ascend beyond the A on the top line is a B. If we add a ledger line, we now have a C. Now let's put the treble and bass clefs together with the treble clef above the bass clef. The first ledger line C above the bass clef and the first ledger line C below the treble clef are the same note. Putting these 2 clefs together creates the grand staff, and the C that we just wrote with 1 ledger line above the bass clef and 1 ledger line below the treble clef is called middle C. Now let's read some music using these 2 clefs. For the treble clef, let's look at the beginning of the last movement of Beethoven's 5th Symphony. First, let's look at the notes that are used in the melody played by the treble instruments, beginning on C, the 3rd space, then E, the 4th space, G on the top of the staff, and then descending F, E, D, C, D, C. Now the next part of the melody or phrase. C to D, D to E, and then a scale from the 3rd space C to the C with 2 ledger lines an octave above the 3rd space C. A scale is a series of single notes ascending or descending stepwise. Any note that connects to the previous note without skipping a letter in the naming of the note is a step. The notes also must connect from a space to a line or a line to a space directly next to it. In the Beethoven 5th example, we have a series of notes that connect in this way: C, D, E, F, E, F, G, A, G, A, B, C. If we look at the bracketed notes, we create a C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We can also do this scale on the treble clef an octave lower, starting with the ledger line below the staff. Again, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. More about scales and steps later. Here is this passage from the Beethoven Fifth, played by the full orchestra. We will highlight the treble instruments playing these notes. Let's look at a C major scale in the bass clef. Again, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, or an octave lower, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Here is the cello and bassoon part at the beginning of the second movement of Robert Schumann's Symphony No. 3. The passage begins on the lowest line, a G, and then the passage continues C, E, G, A, G, C, G, E, C, E, D, G, C, E, G, A, G, E, C, A, E, F sharp, G. Now let's listen to this and follow it in the score with the letters above the actual music. And another moment in the same movement for the cellos and the bassoons. Again, the passage begins on the first line G and then goes up to the second space C, and subsequently B, D, C, E, D, F, E, G, G, octave, and C. Let's once again listen to this and follow it in the score. The more one reads and practices reading, the more proficient we become. There are two more clefs that are commonly used, if not as much as the treble and bass clefs. They are the tenor and the alto clef. Let's first look at the alto clef. The primary use for this clef now is for the viola. It is often referred to as the viola clef. Like all clefs, it was originally used for a particular range of the voice. The treble clef is for the treble voice. The alto clef is for the alto voice. The tenor clef for the tenor voice. The bass clef for the bass voice. There are other clefs that are not used in modern notations corresponding to the other vocal ranges, such as soprano clef, mezzo-soprano clef, and baritone clef. The focal point of the alto clef is on the third line. The note on the third line is a middle C, corresponding to the middle C in the treble clef and bass clef. These notes are all the same note, just notated on different clefs. The other instrument that will on occasion use the alto clef is the trombone. The tenor clef is also a C clef, and its focal point, or middle C, is on the fourth line. This clef is used for any bass instrument playing in its high range, so that the use of many ledger lines can be avoided. If we look at the first page of the score of the last movement of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, we see that the three trombones are notated in alto, tenor, and bass clefs, and we can also see that the violas are notated in alto clef. I have mentioned that notating with many ledger lines can be very difficult to read. That is why the cello, which is generally notated in bass clef, can be notated in tenor and treble clef if a passage is extended with too many ledger lines from the bass clef. Let's look at the opening of Sam Jones's Cello Concerto. The solo cello part begins in bass clef, and at the end of this little passage, it moves to treble clef. What we have are three A's, one in the bass clef, which is on the top line, and then two in the treble clef. Let's listen to this passage. Now let's look at a passage in the third movement of the Jones Concerto that uses the tenor clef. The last note of the second bar on F sharp uses two ledger lines in the bass clef. The next bar begins with exactly the same note, but this time it's in tenor clef, eliminating the need for ledger lines. Let's look at our C major scale on the keyboard of a piano. First, notice that we only use the white keys. Let's begin on the middle C and play the 8-note scale in the treble clef to the next C ascending. Now let's begin on middle C and play the C major scale descending in the bass clef. Still using the piano keyboard, let's study the black notes. To do this, we need to understand accidentals. The two primary accidentals are a sharp and a flat. These signs always precede the note. The sharp changes the note in an upward direction, while a flat changes the note in a downward direction. Let's play a G in the treble clef on the second line. If we add a sharp, we have written the note G sharp, and it is the black key on the piano keyboard just above the G. If we place a flat in front of the G, the note becomes a G flat, and we play the black key just below the G. Let's also do this exercise on an A. First the A, now an A sharp, now the A again, and then A flat. You've probably noticed that the G sharp and the A flat are the same sounding note, but of course they're notated differently. This is called an enharmonic equivalent. The notes have different names, but they sound the same. If we place a sharp in front of a C and a flat in front of a D, these notes sound the same, but again are spelled enharmonically. On our piano keyboard, notice that between the B and C and the E and F, there is no black key. Therefore, a C flat is the same as a B natural, and a B sharp is the same as a C natural. An F flat is the same as an E natural, and an E sharp is the same as an F natural. The sign for a natural looks like this. If a note does not have a flat or sharp before it, it is always a natural with two exceptions. The first exception is when an accidental is placed before a note, that note will always sound that way through the entire bar. Once the bar line appears, the note will return to a natural unless the accidental, sharp or flat, is added again. Let's look at the last movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony once again. Notice the F sharp in the second bar of this excerpt, and then after the bar line, the sharp needs to be added again. In the fourth bar of this excerpt, we notice that the F sharp carries through the bar. The second exception is what is called a key signature. A key signature is a sharp or a flat, or multiple sharps or multiple flats that are placed at the beginning of a line of music between the clef and the time signature, and then at the beginning of the line of music following. For an example, let's add one sharp to the key signature. First the staff, then a clef, let's use the treble clef, then a single sharp, and then the time signature. Let's use 4/4. The first sharp is always an F, and in treble clef is placed on the top line, the fifth line. In a bass clef, the first sharp is placed on the fourth line. The result is that any time an F is played anywhere in this piece, the F will be altered to an F sharp. Let's play 4 Fs, 2 in the bass clef and 2 in the treble clef. Now we add a sharp sign to the beginning of the staff, and all of the Fs now become F sharps. Let's look at one flat in the key signature. The first flat is always a B. In treble clef, it's on the third line. In bass clef, it's on the second line. Again, that means that every B written will be a B flat without the need to add the flat sign before the note again. It's important to learn that if we have sharps in the key signature, we cannot also have flats in the key signature. If we have flats in the key signature, we cannot also have sharps in the key signature. If we are playing a work with one sharp in the key signature, of course we know that sharp is always an F, but the composer would like to have an F natural played. A natural sign would have to be placed before the F. Let's look at the oboe part during a section of the Brahms Academic Festival Overture. We first notice that Brahms writes a sharp sign at the beginning of the line on the fifth line in treble clef. Of course, we know also that that indicates that all Fs are now F sharps. Since Brahms wants an F natural in this bar, he has to add the natural sign. He also does this in the first violin part. The same applies to flats. Let's look at Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony last movement. Notice that the first flat is always a B, and in treble clef, it comes on the third line. In the melody played by the flute, Tchaikovsky wants a B natural rather than a B flat, so he must put a natural sign in front of the B. If we have music with two sharps in the key signature, those sharps are always F and C. Here is a minuet from Mozart's Posthorn Serenade. Notice the two sharps at the start of the movement. If we didn't have the two sharps at the start of the movement, look at all of the accidentals we would have to add. By putting the F and C sharps at the beginning of the line, the music becomes much easier to read. If we have three sharps in the key signature, the three notes that are sharped are F, C, and G. This is the pattern. One sharp is an F. Two sharps, F and C. Three sharps, F, C, and G. Four sharps, F, C, G, D. Five sharps, F, C, G, D, A. Six sharps, F, C, G, D, A, E. And seven sharps, F, C, G, D, A, E, B. With flats, the pattern is one flat is always B, as we've learned. Two flats, B and E. Three flats, B, E, A. Four flats, B, E, A, D. Five flats, B, E, A, D, G. Six flats, B, E, A, D, G, C. And seven flats, B, E, A, D, G, C, and F. I will analyze all of this for you in future lessons. Look at the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. Notice the 5 flats at the beginning of the line. Look at all of the notes that are affected by those 5 flats being in the key signature. We have learned that there are 7 names to all the notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We can now add to that list of 7 all the notes with sharps and flats. So an A, then there could be an A sharp, B, B sharp, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and so forth. The same with flats, A flat, G, G flat, F, F flat, and so forth. Let's go back to our piano keyboard. From the treble clef middle C, let's look at the octave above, the C on the 3rd space. There are 12 notes from the middle C to the 3rd space C. These notes make up the chromatic scale. Remember that between E and F and between B and C, there isn't a black key. Using sharps, here are all of the names of the notes of the chromatic scale. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C. The distance between each of these notes is called a half step, or the interval of a semitone, also called a minor second. An interval is the distance between 2 musical pitches. We already know one interval, an octave, and in future lessons we will discuss many intervals. But for now, let's focus on the interval of a half step. This is a fundamental building block of all musical intervals. A chromatic scale is made up of 12 half steps. Now let's look at a chromatic scale from the 3rd space C in the treble clef, descending using flats. C, B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C. All half steps. Towards the end of Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade in the flute part, he writes a chromatic scale, but he uses a combination of sharps, flats, and naturals to make this scale. All half steps, a chromatic scale.